This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Ixalan, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We're still talking about Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and as usual, at this stage in the format, I like to take a look at 17 lands data and talk about 10 cards that you should probably stop playing based on the data that we have. 17 Lands is a website where you can go and they'll track all of your limited data on Magic Arena. So it has this massive pool of data and we can look at it and try to figure out what it means. Obviously, data is not the end-all, be-all, but it can tell us a lot. I also want to note that there will be an extra Nitsa Notes next week because starting on Tuesday, Khans of Tarkir just will be fully released on Magic Arena and it'll have its own limited format, which is kind of crazy. That's a set that came out in 2014. And they're bringing it back, not with very much fanfare. I'd be surprised if more than like half of you even know that that's going to happen on Magic Arena next week. So I'm going to do a video about the set's mechanics, which will also sort of introduce you to the archetypes on Tuesday next week. So there'll be an extra Nitsa Notes next week about that new old format, I guess. But for now, we're still talking about Lost Caverns of Ixalan. Using 17 lands data, I'm going to tell you about 10 cards that you should stop playing in this limited format. As usual, I like to have a baseline card for us to look at because this allows us to both get used to the data that I'm going to use in this video and talk about a card where we can say, you know, every card on this list is being taken earlier, but it has a significantly lower win rate. So that baseline card I want to talk about is Quicksand Whirlpool. It has a 55.9% win rate. That might sound really high, but as I always want to remind people, you know, the data on 17 lands is from people who have a higher than normal win rate. Of course, Magic's overall win rate is 50% because one person wins and one person loses virtually every game. So you would think the win rate would be about 50%, but it's not. It's about 55 on 17 lands for this format. So this card is, you know, right around solid. You know, it's a decent card. You know, I don't think anyone would look at this and think it's an incredible removal spell. It's a little too conditional when it's cheap, and it's too expensive to be great when, you know, it isn't conditional. So it's a fine card. You end up running one in most of your white decks and feel fine about it. And it's taken around 7.4 by 17 lands users. That's the average taken at stat. And there's also a stat called Average Last Seen, or ALSA, and this particular stat tells us the last point when it's seen by 17 lands users. And what this means, why is there a disparity between the two? In this case, it means because regular people who aren't using 17 lands, seem to be taking Quicksand Whirlpool higher than 17 lands users do, because the average last seen as is about pick 5.2. You know, that stat isn't perfect. It doesn't tell us exactly when the card was taken, but I do think it's interesting to compare these two. You know, basically one is, this is when a 17 lands user takes it, and this is when other people are taking it, roughly. So, the point is, this card is taken, you know, somewhere between 5.2 and 7.4, and it's got a 55.9% win rate. Honestly, I think that is a little bit too high for when people are taking this card. But what we're going to see in this list, as I've already alluded to, is I think almost every, maybe it's just almost every card on the list, they either are taken around the same spot and have a much lower win rate, or they're taken around, or they're taken earlier and they have a much lower win rate. So let's dive into these 10 cards I want to talk to you about, starting with Grasping Shadows, a card with a 49.6% win rate, which is atrocious, and yet the average last seen at is 4.98, and the average taken at is 6.86. So this card is being taken really highly, and it has a very bad win rate, and it simply is a card you shouldn't be running. This was an interesting card to look at in the set review because it did sort of seem like the, you know, the front side of this card would work out okay sometimes, because giving something Death Touch and Lifelink when it attacks alone, like, those are good keywords to give something that's attacking alone. But overall, I wasn't that excited about the card going into the format. Paying 4 for something that only works when you have something worth attacking with to gain these keywords, and then eventually transforming into a land that can draw you cards is nice. But overall, in the set review even, I thought it was too clunky, and it's ended up being even worse than I thought it would be. It's, like I've already said, based on the win rate and everything, it's basically unplayable. And yet it's being taken ahead of Quicksand Whirlpool, both by 17 lands users and, you know, the general drafting population. And it's because it's a cool card. You know, it's an uncommon, it transforms. Most cards that do that kind of thing kind of tend to be good and limited, but this just isn't one of them. Doesn't really add to the board. It doesn't have a big enough impact on the front, and it takes too long to transform to really be something that you want to be playing in a format where you should be trying to be assertive, you know, playing out things that can trade with your opponent's creatures and stuff like that, as opposed to just playing a 4-mana enchantment that basically does nothing. Let's look at another card that's sort of in this category, that being Dowsing Device, which has a win rate of 52.3%, so it's not quite as atrocious as Grasping Shadows, but it's taken around pick 5.52 as the average last seen at, and the average pick is 7.3, so it's taken right around the same time as Quicksand Whirlpool is, despite having a significantly lower win rate. And this card has some really similar problems to what Grasping Shadows has. It is a lot cheaper, and that's a huge factor in why it's not nearly as bad. It still is a card that, like, enhances your creatures if things line up correctly, otherwise it doesn't do anything. So when it enters the battlefield, up to one target creature you control gets +1/+0 and haste until end of turn. So it does do something the turn you play it, theoretically, but that enter the battlefield ability isn't exactly powerful. Haste isn't usually going to matter. The idea is that you get some other artifacts in play and start buffing your creatures. I mean, there are times where this card can perform really impressively, and that's why its win rate isn't completely disastrous. I mean, it's bad, but it's not completely terrible. Like, all the creatures that make map tokens, you know, the blue flyers that do that, can be kind of silly when you play this card. But the question is it just better to play, like, the 2-mana 1/2 Merfolk that explores when it enters a battlefield in, like, a blue-red artifact deck? And the answer is probably yes. I mean, just playing something that actually adds to the board when it's all on its own, and one that can grant, you know, some card selection and or card advantage, is a big difference between a card like this that really needs you to set things up to get going, and even when you do, it's just not that powerful. And that's true when it transforms too. It's just like a clunky land, which, you know, it has an okay mana sink ability, but it's nothing special. So overall, this card just ends up not doing enough to be worth playing in most decks. I do think it has some build-around potential. Like, I can see a deck existing where you have, like, a bunch of artifact creatures. Those are also pretty good with this, by the way, because they'll give themselves +1/+0 and haste when you play them, right? If you have a bunch of those and or cards that make map tokens when they enter the battlefield, you know, running one of these isn't a disaster. And this might be a case where the win rate is as low as it is because people are playing it more like it's a card that should just be in every artifact deck, as opposed to one that needs just the right build to work out. And that is, you know, one of the shortcomings of data is we don't know exactly what decks people are playing this card in. The question is whether it could have a higher win rate if people would sort of pull back and only play it in really specific decks. And I think that probably is the case. But despite that, I think it's better to err on the side of not playing this than playing it, because I think, you know, there's probably, you know, out of 50 drafts you do in this format, there's probably like one where it makes sense to play Dowsing Device, and clearly people are playing it way too often. All right, next let's look at Growing Rights of Lamok. I do have 2 rares on here. This is mostly commons and uncommons, but there are a couple of rares that are so bad and being taken so highly that I wanted to talk about them. And this is one of them, Growing Rights of Lamok. It's actually a reprint, and it was bad last time, so I'm not really sure what people are doing, if I'm being honest. So this has an average last seen at, an ALSA of 3.69, and an average taken at of 5.25. So again, this is taken way before Quicksand Whirlpool ever is, and then it has a 49.7% win rate, which is, you know, once we're in the 40s, we can pretty much say a card's unplayable and limited, and that's what we're talking about here. The problem with this card is very similar to Grasping Shadows and Dowsing Device. It doesn't do anything. You know, that's cards that don't do anything have become a liability in most limited formats of late. And, you know, it doesn't literally do nothing, but when I say that, what I mean is this card does not add to the board. And so you really need to lean on the front side of this card for it to be worth playing, because the backside just doesn't matter in Limited. Sure, it turns into Gaia's Cradle, that's exciting, and maybe that's the reason, you know, people are seeing that Gaia's Cradle text box and they just can't handle it. You know, they just want to play this card, but that kind of card just doesn't do anything in Limited, because by the time you flip this, you don't need the mana. So, yeah. The front side, meanwhile, is just like, you know, an anticipate type effect that costs 3 and is sorcery speed, right? You look at the top 4, and you put a creature from among them into your hand. That's not good enough. You know, you're breaking even on cards. You know, you're spending a card and getting a card. And you're doing that for 3 mana. You know, that's really bad. You know, 3 mana tutors usually aren't good enough in Limited, right? Because they don't do anything. And this is worse than that, because it doesn't just grab you whatever you want, it just grabs a creature. and it's only in the top 4. There is a chance you whiff. I mean, it's not super high in most decks, but that also is, you know, the floor of this card is miserable, and the ceiling is, like, not especially good either. So, don't play Growing Rights of Lamok in Limited. Gaia's Cradle's exciting, but Growing Rights of Lamok is not. All right, next up, let's look at Cosmium Blast. This is an especially interesting one to compare to Quicksand Whirlpool because they are similar cards. So Cosmium Blast has a win rate of 53.7%. Not entirely disastrous, but it's being taken right around the same time as Quicksand Whirlpool. It has an ALSA of 5.42 and an average taken of 7.86. So that's right around where Quicksand Whirlpool is taken. But Quicksand Whirlpool has a win rate, you know, 2.2% higher. So what's the reason for that? Well, there's a few, really. Cosmium Blast is cheaper, but it's hugely situational. You know, it doesn't always do something. So like Quicksand Whirlpool, it's definitely not premium removal, but it has a few problems that make it worse in this format than I think it would be in most. One of them is the fact that the thing it kills just goes to the graveyard, and you know, that's a liability in this format. Almost every deck in the format is going to have something that can utilize the thing that you killed one way or another. So that's a problem. Furthermore, Quicksand Whirlpool, you know, may cost 1 more, but it can just always get rid of the thing, you know? It's situational, but can always get rid of it. And then it has this late game effect where it can get rid of it, period. It's not situational. So Quicksand Whirlpool is significantly better than Cosmium Blast, and I would always lean towards playing the Whirlpool. Of course, if you're going to be running one of these effects, it's kind of weird they have 3 of these in this format at common and uncommon, but if you're going to be running 3 of these, the one that you really want is the 1 in a white artifact that does 5, you know, to the creature and can transform into a vehicle. That one's insane, and that's probably another reason both of these are sort of meh, is you have that one lying around, and on top of that, the fact that there are 3 effects like this means that it's easier for your opponents to play around all of it, you know, because they know it's coming. And it's easier to play around Cosmium Blast than it is Quicksand Whirlpool because it's damage-based. So, all that said, you know, Cosmium Blast doesn't quite live up to the title, maybe, of this video, which is that you have to stop playing it. You'll run one if you really, really have to, but you're hoping you don't. There's a better common around in Quicksand Whirlpool if you really need removal like it. And you can get it right around the same time, you know, which really further hurts Cosmium Blast's stock. All right, let's look at Curator of Sun's Creation next. This has a 51% win rate, which is awful, and it's another card taken right around the same time as Quicksand Whirlpool, 5.55 ALSA and 7.78 average taken at. So, this card's interesting. You know, it's people always, when you talk about any card and you're evaluating it and you're saying you shouldn't play that card, the response is always, well, it won me the game once, you know, and that's true. You'll notice none of these cards have a 0% win rate. Like, that's not going to happen in Magic, and it's because, you know, first of all, these win rates are measuring not just what this card did for you, so that's a factor, but also virtually every Magic card has a time where it can be good. What makes a Magic card bad is that those times aren't that attainable. They're too narrow, or the floor of the card is awful. And that's what's happened with Curator of Sun's Creation. I think we've probably all lost to Curator of Sun's Creation at this point, because if your opponent plays it and then plays, you know, the Itali's Aura with Discover 3, like, that's not that easy to beat, right? If it lines up that way, your opponent gets some insane card advantage, and that's true. you've seen me lose probably on this channel to Curator Sun's Creation. But we have to take into account all the times that this card is played, not just the times where it wins you the game, which is going to happen sometimes, because this does have a really high ceiling. The problem is, first, the floor is awful. 4 mana 3/3 and limited. Like, it's been a while since we've seen, you know, especially at common and uncommon, a Hill Giant, you know, another name for a 4 mana 3/3, with, like, some effect that doesn't do anything right away. It's been a while since we've seen one work out. You know, we've seen, like, 4 mana 3/3s that draw you a card when an enchantment goes to your graveyard. Basically, all of them we've seen over the last several sets just aren't good. And that's because they are incredibly inefficient. Formats these days have, you know, at least a couple of archetypes that will just curve out and kill you, and they back that up with combat tricks, or they can use cheap removal that costs 2 mana, in this case, to kill your 4 mana card. So you take a huge tempo hit. The Curator can't block that effectively, and so what you need to do is make it to your next turn, A, with the Curator around, and B, have a card that discovers. Both of those lining up and doing enough to compensate for how bad the baseline is here, it just doesn't happen often enough. As the data here, which is, you know, from tens of thousands of drafts, as the data here is telling us, it doesn't work out. So it's not a card that works. You know, this could be another case where people are playing it too much. Like, if you have a critical mass of Discover somehow, if you have 10 cards with Discover, which is hard to do, there aren't that many of them around, and there especially aren't that many at common, but if you could do it, the Curator would obviously be better, because the chances of you lining things up perfectly is higher. But if you have like 3 cards with Discover, not enough. And that's usually what you're going to have, and you're usually going to have less. So Curator just isn't good enough to play in, you know, 99.9% of decks. All right, let's take a look now at another rare, the second rare. We already looked at Growing Rights of Lamok. The other one is Get Lost, and I want to talk about this one in particular because of, you know, the the reaction I always get to evaluating this kind of card in the set review and even after the set review. And by this kind of card, I mean removal spells that give the opponent something, something valuable. And those are never good in limited. They tend to be better in constructed because, like, an aggro deck can use a cheap removal spell like this and then, you know, kill the opponent before it ever matters that you gave them maps. This format's fast, but it's not that fast. And Get Lost's win rate is 50.4%, which is abysmal. It's a card basically you should never play. And sure, you know, the comfort of having a card that can deal with, like, any threat, you know, that can feel pretty good. But in limited, you know, card advantage is always going to be a huge deal because games generally, even with a good aggro deck, aren't fast enough. So giving your opponent 2 map tokens is a massive downside. Your opponent can use those tokens, tap them for value if they're in a deck like red-white. They can sacrifice them if they're in a deck like black-white. They can craft them away if they're in a deck like blue-white. And they can just use the maps for value that they already inherently have because of how they work. You know, your opponent can draw cards off of them, they get counters. It's just not worth using a removal spell that does this at really any stage of the game. Again, there are going to be times where this kills your opponent's bomb and it feels like it was worth it, but those don't line up often enough, and that makes Get Lost a really, really bad rare. But people are taking it like it's amazing. They're taking it average last seen out of 2.6 and average taken out of 2.95. And really, it should be one of the last cards in the pack. Let's look now at Enterprising Scallywag. This one surprised me when I was looking at the data. So far, you know, it's another card that doesn't have a completely horrendous win rate. It has a win rate of 53.4%. I mean, that's bad because it's like 2% lower than, you know, what would normally be like a C-level card. So it's kind of like a D. You know, that's kind of where it's sitting, and that is surprising a little bit. You know, it's a 2-mana 2/2, spits out a treasure if you've descended at the end of your turn. And, like, you know, there are blue-red decks that care about artifacts and pirates, and the Scallywag kind of checks those boxes, but overall, it seems clearly like it's just not doing enough. Certainly not enough to be taken around pick 3.89, or by 17 lands users at 4.94. Treasure has diminishing returns, even in this format, the longer the game goes on, and most of the time in the early game, this isn't going to give you the mana boost you're really looking for, because it's not that easy to set up Descend in red in the early game. Like, it just doesn't happen that often. Sometimes, yeah, a creature will trade, and then you'll play this and you'll get a treasure, and that feels fine. But there are a lot of times where the scallywag is just a 2-mana 2/2. And that's not a miserable floor. It's not like we're talking about a 4-mana 3/3 like we were with Curator of Sun's Creation. But we are talking about a pretty mediocre stat line that ends up being the card's use case most often. And that's basically what it ends up doing. There are times where you can really, if you have the blue-red signpost in play that gives you a counter on a pirate every time an artifact enters, like if you're also getting a counter every time this triggers, it gets better. But this is limited we're talking about. Things don't line up perfectly like that often enough for the scallywag to be great. This is another one that's not like completely unplayable. You can play it if you need to. If your deck has a lot of artifact and pirate synergy, it's going to end up being better than a 53.4% win rate. But people are playing this card way too often in way too many decks, and that's what results in this huge gap between how highly it's being taken and what its win rate is. Similar card is Careening Minecart. So this is that 3-mana 3/3 vehicle with crew 1, gets a treasure when it attacks. This is a little bit better than Scallywag. It has the highest win rate of anything on this list, of 53.9%, which is still 2 full percentage points worse than Quicksand Whirlpool. But it's being taken around pick 4 as Alsa, and the average pick is around pick 5, which is way too high. So again, treasure is nice, and if you can get it going early, that's kind of when it's the most useful. It gets a lot worse the longer the game goes on, and a 3/3 vehicle becomes less and less relevant the longer the game goes on. And the other thing about this particular vehicle is, unlike a lot of them, which have at least like super, they have good stats for how much they cost, like this doesn't really. It has stats you kind of expect for 3 mana, and then you have to jump through hoops of crewing 1, which isn't the biggest hoop, but it is one, to become a creature, and then the upside is you get a treasure. So we're talking about a pretty mediocre floor, pretty mediocre ceiling, and that results in this card really underperforming based on where people seem to be taking it. Let's look now at Mischievous Pup. This kind of card always seems to underperform, and this is one, I definitely overrated it in my set review, and I think probably everyone did. I don't know why we always think this kind of card is going to work out. And what I mean when I say this kind of card is a creature who can return stuff to your hand at instant speed. I guess maybe it's a result of the card in the last set that bounced something to your hand. Actually, that was in the Lord of the Rings set, wasn't it? But it let you bounce something to your hand, and there was enough synergy in the set for putting something back in your hand and then playing something that it worked out pretty well. That's not really the case with Mischievous Pup. It has a win rate of 52.7%. And despite that, it's got an ALSA of 4.66 and an average pick of 6.09. So, yeah, we're talking about a card that clearly isn't doing the job well enough. It's always easy to look at this kind of card and think about the upside, which is, hey, I can have my creature dodge a removal spell. Hey, I can rebuy an Enter the Battlefield ability. Hey, I can make Petrify fall off of my creature. And when you make a list like that, it's like, okay, that's enough ways I can use this that it will overcome the fact that it's a 3-mana 3/1. Like, that's such a long list. But if you actually put like percentage numbers next to all of those things, you're gonna find that it doesn't do that like 80% of the time. You end up having to use this in such a way that it has no or a minimal effect 4 times out of 5, basically. And the upside that you get sometimes, bouncing something to your hand, blinking a removal spell, that upside from 20% of the time isn't enough to offset this being a 3-mana 3/1, especially in a set with lots of 1/1 tokens that can block it. Like, the stat line is horrendous, even at instant speed, even with flash. Like most cards like this, it shouldn't have surprised me or anyone else. This hasn't really done what you'd expect it to do. It's been super underwhelming and really isn't a card you should be playing. And then our last card is Katti Scavenger. So sort of like with the Scallywag, this one surprised me a little bit that it's as low as it is. It's got a win rate of 53.3%, so sort of respectable. But it's got an ALSA of 4.59 and an average pick of 6.14. So people are taking it higher, significantly higher than Quicksand Whirlpool, and it's got a win rate 2.6% lower. So this is most of the cards on this list, the basic problem with them, most of them, is they have bad floors, and the ceiling they have is either harder to attain than expected, or not high enough. And Katti Scavenger is another card that's in this group. The floor, 3 mana, 3/2. Horrible stat line in this day and age where you just can't play a card. Like, if this was just a blank 3 mana, 3/2, it would have a lower win rate, obviously. It'd probably be in the 40s. But it ends up being that card way too often, especially on turn 3. And, you know, we look at these cards in the set review and we're like, okay, I mean, you know, it has this late game upside where it can return something to your hand. Cool. And then, you know, if you play it on turn 3, it doesn't feel awful, but it turns out it does. Like, these kinds of cards in this world of combat tricks, in this world of 1 mana removal that can kill a 2 toughness creature, those outcomes are awful for you, where you can't block effectively or break even on your mana in any way, shape, or form. Like, those cards end up hurting in a big way. And so, sure, in the later game, you know, if we could look at what this card's win rate is in the later game, and we can sort of do some of that because there are cards where you can look at what the win rate is when it's in your opening hand and what the win rate is when you draw it later in the game. And sometimes that's interesting to look at, and we can do it to some extent, but it's not perfect because, you know, that's not how Magic works necessarily. We don't know exactly, like, if we could look at what turn the card was played, I think that's where it would be the most interesting, as opposed to just looking at, you know, whether it's in your opening hand or not. But if we could look at what it does in the late game, sure, it's awesome. You know, you get Eternal Witness, basically, right? With even, you know, +1/+1 Eternal Witness. That's easier to cast, right? But Eternal Witness always does its thing, and this doesn't. And that ends up being a big problem, because the 3 mana 3/2 is just that bad. So, those are my picks for 10 cards from Lost Caverns of Ixalan that you need to stop playing. If you do, your win rate is likely to be a lot higher. Just a reminder, I will be having a bonus Need to Notes next week on Tuesday, talking about the Khans of Tarkir limited format the day it comes out. There will also be, next Saturday, another Need to Notes, and like usual, the one following this will be where I look at the opposite end of the spectrum, where we take a look at win rates of cards that are high, given where they're being taken in the draft. So basically, it'll be 10 cards you should be playing more of. That does it for this video, though. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including more videos about this limited format, draft videos of this format, you should see those on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.